Palestina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en I-24 News.
Ой, осторожно. У него мало таких бородавочек, у него как-то побольше на спине.
Welcome, you're watching I-24 News, coming to you live from Tel Aviv. The top stories this hour. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken meets Israel's leaders in Jerusalem and inspects aid deliveries to Gaza. Hamas is yet to respond to Israel's latest offer of a ceasefire and prisoner release in exchange for some of the hostages. And Iraq repatriates hundreds more of its citizens from an ISIS prison camp in Syria. First, Hamas says it will respond very soon to Israel's latest offer of a ceasefire, which is currently being discussed in Cairo. It comes as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visits Israel's leaders and the families of some of the hostages, while hardline ministers threaten to bring down Prime Minister Netanyahu's government if he fails to send troops into Rafah. Our Ariel Osseran has the latest.
As Israel awaits Hamas's response to a proposed deal for a Gaza ceasefire and the release of hostages, far-right ministers in the ruling coalition are set on blocking an agreement, calling it, quote, a humiliating surrender.
חיילים שעזבו הכל מאחור ויצאו להילחם למען המטרות שהממשלה הגדירה. זה אנחנו זורקים את זה לפח בשביל עכשיו להציל 22 איש או 33 איש או לא יודעת כמה. אין לממשלה כזו
I finished a meeting with the Prime Minister at my request. I warned the Prime Minister, if you don't enter Rafah, God forbid, we end the war, God forbid, there will be a terrible deal. The Prime Minister promised that Israel will enter Rafah and will not end the war, and promised that there would be no terrible deal.
Meanwhile, the Lebanese Al-Akhbar newspaper published details of the proposal sent to Hamas. The three-phase deal would reportedly see the release of at least 33 hostages. All the women, civilians and soldiers, minors and men over the age of 50. In exchange, Israel agrees to a 40-day truce that could be extended and will release 20 Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli hostage. The mediators, according to the proposal, hope the deal will bring upon, quote, sustainable calm in Gaza.
The state of Qatar calls for an immediate ceasefire, an end to military operations, and the release of all prisoners on both sides, and the provision of all humanitarian and relief assistance.
And so, with Hamas's response expected on Wednesday, the prospect of a deal to save the remaining 133 hostages is also threatening to collapse the current coalition. Once again, the Israeli government finds itself walking a tightrope, both inside the cabinet room and outside it.
Well, with me in the studio this hour, Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States and the former deputy foreign minister. Good evening to you, Danny. We're also joined by Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital, former commander of the Special Forces in the IDF. Good evening, Doron, to you as well. Ambassador Ayalon, I'll start with you. I mean, here we are with a huge political row in Israel, even as we wait to hear how Hamas will respond to that latest offer of a ceasefire.
Yeah, which actually shows the vulnerability of this government, and maybe this explains somewhat why this government is not really in control of the situation, but it's being dragged, and every little wind kind of puts it in a different position. I'm afraid that if there is a deal, then this would be the demise of this government. But trust Netanyahu that he can always push or pull out of his sleeves new cards, and probably if there is a deal, Gantz and Eisenkot will stay. And when they do stay, then the government continues, at least for a while.
Doron Avital, what are your thoughts on the situation as we wait to hear?
I want to be optimistic about the possibility, at least of the first stage of the deal, the humanitarian stage, which I think there's some in the Israeli public wide consensus that it must go forward. And the question, of course, as Danny pointed out, is the question of the stability of the coalition. But I think in the end, even they would be afraid to leave the government, and of course, so let's see the political structure.
Does this division strengthen the hand of Hamas, do you think?
I'm not sure. Hamas knows us very well, as we unfortunately know by now. This is a liberal democracy. I mean, they know how we play. They know it's the value that we give to these hostages. They know the history that we have with hostages. We did a rescue operation far away from Israel. We will invest any resources. So I don't think this kind of an argument doesn't work. He knows that he can force us on this issue. The only thing that we cannot agree is this decision of all of fire or the end of the war in general. And I would say hostages first. The war we can continue for years. We always have enemies, and Hamas will continue to be our enemy.
All right, thank you both. Well, let's go down to central Tel Aviv, because our correspondent Balir Sladin is in Hostage Square with the families of some of the hostages. And Balir, some details of what is reportedly being discussed in Cairo has been reported in Arabic media. Just tell us a bit about what we know so far.
Yes, Al-Akhbar newspaper, Lebanese newspaper, very close to Hezbollah in Lebanon, are saying that they have the draft that contains the phases of the deal, 3 phases that we're talking about. The first one is a humanitarian one that includes the release of women, children, elderly, wounded, and also the female soldiers. From what we understand, Israel will release from the Israeli prisons, Palestinian security prisoners, 20 for each of the elderly or the women or the children, and 40, including some that have a sentence that is longer than 10 years from the Israeli jails for each female soldier. That's according to the report. And for the first phase, the second phase will include the release of the rest of the hostages, including the male soldiers, everyone who is actually alive that is not a humanitarian or it doesn't belong to the first stage, the humanitarian stage. And the third one, it will be the return of the bodies of the Israeli hostages that remain in Gaza, with Israeli guarantees that it will rehabilitate Gaza for the next 5 years. Now, this is a deal that some of the Israelis would say is a good deal, at least for the first and the second stage. But what some other families of the hostages and other Israelis are saying, that this could actually be a bad idea, because if Israel goes with the first phase and gives all what Hamas wants, the return of the Palestinians to the north of Gaza, the cancellation or the delay of the Rafah operation, and also the Israeli soldiers will be out of Gaza, then what would be Israel able to give Hamas after that first stage in order to get back all the rest of the hostages? And that's why we are hearing Smotrich, also some families of the hostages, and Uri Struk today are saying that only with military pressure Israel can pressure Hamas to give all the hostages all at once in order to stop the war at some point. But it can be working with this 3 stages or 3 phases deal.
Thank you very much, Balir Sladin there in central Tel Aviv. Well, to talk a bit more about the deal, we're joined on the line by Ori Slonim, former special advisor to Ministers of Defence on hostages and missing people. Thank you very much for being with us, Ori Slonim. And first of all, I mean, a lot of talk about numbers, the number of hostages for the number of prisoners, etc. But the bottom line seems to be that Hamas's position is consistent. There won't be any deal unless Israel agrees to a complete end to its operation in Gaza.
My first view, I believe that I spoke about it also in your TV station, was that we had to do it in one stage with one release of those who are going to be released from our side. And all these mid steps are something that I believe are very, very bad. Now we are in this situation that we are waiting for a response. Who knows what will be this response, and regarding who is going to be freed and how many. And we are talking about a very, very symbolic number of people to be released. And we have there 133. I believe that some of them, unfortunately, are not alive. But I'm afraid of all these stages, what we call stages, we call it in Hebrew, peima. I would prefer to do everything in one shot. And regarding the stopping of the operation, from my point of view, which is very personal, I'm not representing not my government, neither anybody else but myself. I would prefer one long ceasefire for everybody.
All right, Ori Slonim, thank you. Stay with us. Ambassador Daniel Alon, I'll put that to you. Is that the right strategy? Do you think should Israel hold out for a one-shot deal to get all of the hostages back, or to do it in a more staged?
I think we're at the stage. I mean, we missed this opportunity. Probably could have been done maybe when the first deal was stricken. This was the time to do it all for all, and maybe even for a ceasefire as they demanded, believing that we would have ample opportunities to go back into Gaza, because I would not trust Hamas or any of the other renegade organizations to keep a ceasefire. At this stage today, I think we should be able to get out anyone that we can, because time is running out for them.
Even if it's just 10, 15 people?
So even if, yes, because I think everyone now is under a real threat of losing their lives.
Doron, you agree with that?
I think, yeah, certainly. As in the battlefield, you do what's possible, what is visible, what is at your hands. And I think if there's a humanitarian deal for 30 or whatever, do it. Don't play around. Whatever we can, we should do in whatever stage comes. So I don't see a one package deal, but I do say stages, and I want to get whatever I can when I can.
Okay, Ori Slonim, let me bring you back in. What about the argument then that the only way to get these hostages back is via military pressure on Hamas? What do you think of that argument, and is that an argument for going into Rafah?
I think that the operation in Rafah can be waiting for the near future or even the far future. Nothing is running out of this awful area, and I trust that I thought that my friends, my colleagues there in your studio, I accept everything that they are talking about. Anybody who can be saved within any stage should be back home, because it's an awful situation of, I believe that nobody knows if you will be alive the next moment.
In terms of influence over Hamas, Cairo seems to be dominating the headlines a lot more than Doha at the moment. And who do you think has more influence, and does that make any difference at all?
For me, everybody is a good mediator if he succeeds, and I'm not the one to prefer one or the other. I would like everybody, including the Satan, to assist us to bring them back.
Advocate Ori Slonim, thank you very much indeed. Well, the French Foreign Minister has arrived in Cairo today as part of his regional tour, and Cairo is continuing to host those talks. Or we can talk now to Hossein Kamel Hariri. He's the former assistant to the Egyptian Foreign Minister and the former director of the Department of Israeli Affairs at the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. Good evening to you, sir. Thank you for being with us. How concerned is the Egyptian government about a potential IDF offensive right on its border in Rafah if this deal collapses, if Hamas says no once again?
Well, Egypt has been on record for some time now against any Israeli military intrusion in Rafah for various reasons. The main one is that it won't save the lives of the Israeli hostages. On the contrary, it could put them, all of them, if they are at Rafah, that it could put their lives at high risk. This is the first thing. The second thing, if the Israeli government believes that a military offensive, a military attack in Rafah would destroy Hamas till complete victory, quoting the Israeli prime minister, we in Cairo doubt that very, very much. Thirdly, that if there will be such an attack, no one knows right now how long it will be, how major it will be, and how long the Israeli forces that would be carrying out this attack would remain in Rafah, that is to say, near or close to the Egyptian border. In this context, that would put the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, particularly the defense annex, at jeopardy. So these are the main concerns of Egypt. And I understand that the Egyptian government has already communicated these concerns to the Israeli side, as well as to the American administration.
So Egypt, on that issue at least, is in agreement with Hamas that Israel must end the war in Gaza. It must completely wrap up operations. It must leave. It must withdraw in order for any hostage deal to go ahead. Is that what you're saying?
Well, from an Egyptian point of view, this has nothing to do with we are in agreement or not in agreement with Hamas. From an strictly Egyptian point of view, we doubt very much that the continuation of the war that Israel has launched against Gaza from October 7th would achieve anything. We believe, aside, of course, not aside, but on top of the disastrous human toll on the Palestinian civilians, we doubt very much, madam, if Israel would really carry out all its objectives by the continuation of this war. On the contrary, we believe that the shorter the war becomes, the closer we come to a ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire that would save the lives of most hostages.
Well,
speaking of the hostages, we in Egypt would like them to be freed, okay? But that should be linked to an agreement on the part of Israel, to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and to the withdrawal, a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Neither Egypt, nor the international community, nor the Palestinians would accept the presence of Egyptian forces, of Israeli
troops. I understand, but can there be any peace long term if Hamas is allowed to stay in power in Gaza? They have said they will continue to attack Israel. Israel would then respond. Isn't this just drawing out the suffering for Palestinian civilians in Gaza, in that they would have to deal with this cycle of violence again and again?
We in Egypt are against the cycle of violence. We in Egypt are against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. We in Egypt are against, and we have been on record saying that to the various Israeli governments for the last decade. The encirclement of Gaza, the siege of Gaza would render no services to Egypt, and that, unfortunately, regrettably, that October 7th proved. So we are looking to the future now, madam. Let's the past be behind us. We cannot.
But can there be peace long term if Hamas is still in power in Gaza?
But who said Hamas would be in power in Gaza for
because
forever?
If the IDF does not finish those final battalions, they would still be in power. They would still be a political force in Gaza.
Frankly speaking, honestly speaking, madam, we cannot hold 2 million people, as well of Palestinians, as well the Israeli people, hostage to 4 battalions. And even from a military point of view, what the 4 battalions would do against the Israeli army, madam. Let's be honest, let's be frank, and let's be fair. I guess that these 4 battalions are being used as an excuse by Mr. Netanyahu and his ruling coalition to stay for an indefinite period in Gaza. And I don't think that would be advantageous or that would be useful in the long term for Israeli security concerns.
So just to be clear, sorry to interrupt, just to be clear, do you believe then the IDF has done enough to weaken Hamas? It is no longer a political force in Gaza?
We believe so, madam. And now we have we call on the Israeli government to start dealing with the situation in Gaza in another context. Gaza, Hamas is not Gaza. Hamas is not Gaza. The West Bank, Hamas is not the West Bank. Hamas is one faction in the Palestinian, the national Palestinian movement. Of course, we can discuss, we can debate why Mr. Netanyahu and his coalition, ruling coalition, always speaks about Hamas, about Iran, about the Ayatollah, about Hezbollah. Israel can never remain at war with its neighbors for good, madam. Let's think out of the box. Let's think, okay, there have been wars, there were military confrontations between the Israeli army and Hamas and Hezbollah. But let's have the courage to put that behind us and start to think along new avenues, new approaches.
Mr. Haredi, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, madam.
And Ambassador Danny Ayalon and Doron Avital with me in the studio. Danny, just your response to what you just heard.
Well, this is the Egyptian, let's say, official position. We know very well that this current Egyptian regime sees the Hamas, which is part of the greater movement of the Ikhwan, as they are called, the Muslim Brotherhood, as a mortal threat to this regime. And they would very much like to see Hamas as not a player.
But what do you think
anymore.
about what he's saying, that there's no need to go into Rafah? It will do more harm than good because Hamas is already weakened, and they foresee the Egyptians would like a future without Hamas.
Well, it's very easy to talk about it from a theoretical point of view, but I would say that with Egypt, if they want to play a responsible part, I would expect them to block totally the Philadelphia road, so which is the gateway to the Sinai, where most of the illegal arms that was smuggled by Hamas to Gaza. So if there was a situation where the Philadelphia is totally sealed in a verifiable way, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, we can get a new regime, civilian regime. I even agree that it should be a Palestinian regime. The Americans brought about a new formula which is called a revitalized Palestinian Authority. Of course, we have to go down and specify what is a revitalized Palestinian Authority.
But there are efforts to make changes.
But this is a long way, and just to say for the IDF to get out of Gaza, this is really very myopic and not solving any problem.
Doron Avital, I mean, just mentioning the prospect of jeopardizing the peace treaty with Egypt, that would be very serious.
I think it's an important point because in many respects, as Danny said, we are partners with Egyptian against a common enemy, the Islamic Brotherhood, and Hamas as representative of them in the Palestinian court. But partners can have disagreement, and there's the political rhetoric, and there's the security interest underneath, and the Egyptian can help us. In no way should we put in risk this great milestone of the Israeli-Arab conflict, which is the peace with Egypt, which ignited the whole process of then the Oslo Accords and the peace with Jordan. This is clearly should not be at risk in no way, and the Rafah issue brings the complexity of the issue to the front, and we have to consider it seriously.
All right, both of you, thank you. While construction is underway inside Gaza on a floating pier off the coast, which is designed to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. But will it be enough to alleviate the civilian suffering and the international pressure on Israel? Our Joe Brown has more in this report.
A figure of aid. Satellite images have been released showing the construction of the so-called floating pier, a platform acting as a port around 7 miles off the coast of Gaza, which will allow for greater humanitarian aid to reach the Gaza Strip. The US-built pier will cost around $320 million, around double the original estimate, and provisionally will be ready as early as next week. The pier will consist of a floating dock, where ships can drop off their aid. From there, they will be taken via third-party trucks down a causeway that is connected to the Gaza coastline. The floating dock can supposedly hold 1,800 tons of aid per day. This comes at a pivotal time for Israel, as international pressure is growing on them to allow more aid into the Gaza Strip, both from the US, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the Americans' 9th visit to Israel since the war began, as well as from international bodies.
We must do everything possible to avert an entirely preventable human-made famine. We have seen incremental progress recently, but much more is urgently needed, including the promised opening of the 2 crossing points between Israel and northern Gaza, so that aid can be brought into Gaza from Ashdod port and Jordan.
The aforementioned Ashdod port has been the site of protests from right-wing Israelis over the past few months, mirroring those from the Kerem Shalom crossing, as a small pocket of the Israeli society has shown opposition to the aid being sent into Gaza, as they claim it is being hijacked by Hamas terrorists. But this isn't stopping Israel from sending hundreds of trucks of aid into Gaza in order to limit the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding. The IDF claims that a daily average of 350 aid trucks have entered Gaza over the last month, as well as aid drops from foreign countries. Coupled with the new pier, this aid will be essential for the Gazan people and for Israel's operations in the Gaza Strip.
And Danny Ayalon, this has been one of the main criticisms of Israel, hasn't it? Not allowing enough aid into Gaza.
Yes, but the counter argument, of course, is that the aid to Gaza is being controlled by Hamas. The problem is not the aid coming into Gaza, but the distribution of it in an equitable way, and this has not been the case. We saw just now the artificial new pier or port. I'm not sure that this would really be of a great help. I don't think the problem is the supply of the humanitarian aid. You can bring them from Ashdod, you can bring them from the Rafah side, many other passages in Kerem Shalom and others. The problem again is how to control the distribution.
Okay, all right, we're going to take a short break. Thank you, Danny. We'll be back in a few moments because the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is here in Israel, and he's been visiting some of the points of crossings to get aid into Gaza. We'll talk a bit more about that after the break. Stay with us.
Israel's story must reach the whole world. The I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds.
De la frontière qui sépare Israël.
The state of emergency and war in Israel.
Bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News Channels. Now on Hot.
Welcome back. And as Israel awaits a response from Hamas over whether or not it will accept the latest offer of a ceasefire in exchange for some of the hostages, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is here in Israel. Earlier, he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He also met with President Herzog and came down from his hotel in Tel Aviv to meet with the families of some of those still being held in Gaza, among them, of course, 8 American citizens. Our senior correspondent, Bianca Zanini, has more on the visit now.
Not much can stop an Israeli military tank, but a long-awaited ceasefire for hostages deal between Hamas and Israel might. The stakes are getting higher by the minute as the world holds its breath. U.S. President Joe Biden stating that the only obstacle to an immediate ceasefire and relief for civilians in Gaza is Hamas. With domestic political criticism mounting against Washington's support for Israel's war in Gaza, the Biden administration has been pushing increasingly harder for a ceasefire. On Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken landed in Israel again and met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. He also met with families of some of the hostages being held in Gaza since the beginning of the war. Biden addressed a group of protesters in Tel Aviv who are calling for the Prime Minister to reach a deal now.
Bringing your loved ones home is at the heart of everything we're trying to do. And we will not rest until everyone, man, woman, soldier, civilian, young, old, is back home. There is a very strong proposal on the table right now. Hamas needs to say yes and needs to get this done. That is our determination, and we will not rest, we will not stop until you're reunited with your loved ones. So please, keep strong, keep the faith. We will be with you every single day until we get this done.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been under increased domestic and international pressure to reach a deal and has softened his original demands. But looming over the negotiations is Israel's promised military operation in the Hamas stronghold of Rafah in Gaza, which Netanyahu says will happen regardless of a deal. Another main obstacle is Hamas's demand that a ceasefire be permanent, something Israel refuses. The terror group that governs the Gaza Strip is expected to respond to what the U.S. is calling an extraordinarily generous Israeli offer within the next few days. After months of stalled negotiations, now cautious optimism.
Well, with me in the studio this hour, Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Doron Avital, Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital, former commander in the Special Forces of the IDF. And here we are, visit number 9 for America's top diplomat here in Israel. How is he helping the situation? Is he helping?
I think it's clear what's the strategy of the U.S. They are playing on different dimensions. They have, of course, the Saudi deal, and they see it as part.
Sorry to interrupt you, Doron. We're hearing Secretary Blinken is making remarks
good.
now. We're going to take it. So let's go for it.
Israel and Hamas, and that is trying to make sure that people who have been caught in this crossfire get the assistance they need, the humanitarian assistance they need. And this has been, as I said, a priority for the president from day one. It's been a focus of every trip that I've taken to the region, and this is now, I think, my 7th since October 7th. We have seen in recent weeks real, meaningful progress that is starting to make a difference for people in Gaza. Yesterday we were in Jordan. Some of you saw the trucks being loaded in Jordan. They went through Erez for the first time today, and that's very important because that's direct access to the north of Gaza. And this is the result of a very important collaboration involving Israel, involving Jordan, involving as well the United Nations. We have our own maritime corridor that is probably a week away from being operational. And here in Ashdod, Israel's primary port, we're now seeing a real flow of assistance that is going to the people in Gaza. And it's a pretty good example of all the efforts that the president's been making on this. Back in February, he requested of Israel that they allow flour to come through Ashdod. And as a result, we had U.S. flour going to Gaza, enough to feed 1.5 million Gazans for 5 months. Now we're getting all other items coming here through Ashdod, and they'll be going to Gaza. So we're seeing, as I said, real demonstrable progress. I discussed that today as well with the Minister of Defense, as well as the Army Chief of Staff, and all those working on the Israeli side to make sure that assistance is moving and flowing to Gaza. And we got a detailed briefing on that. We had the senior UN coordinator, Sigrid Kaag, with us, who's playing an instrumental role along with many UN agencies. So the progress is real, but given the need, given the immense need in Gaza, it needs to be accelerated, it needs to be sustained. And as we focus on all of the necessary inputs, the number of trucks that are moving, what matters the most is the impact. And we're focused on measuring that, making sure that people are actually getting what they need, that it's being delivered to them. One of the remaining challenges is making sure that when assistance gets through, it can be effectively distributed within Gaza. And we have to make sure that it's not interfered with or impeded by Hamas. So these are remaining challenges, and there are a number of others as well, particularly making sure that we have effective deconfliction and coordination with the humanitarians. There's been, I think, a significant improvement there as well, but it has to, we have to make sure that that's happening right down to the unit level so that everyone in the chain knows when a shipment is moving through, a convoy is moving through Gaza, and it can work its way through efficiently, effectively, and get to people who need it. There are a number of other things that we want to see continued progress on. I left a list of items with the Prime Minister and with other officials in the government. There's one other aspect of this that's critical, and I mentioned this yesterday. Besides the food, it's hugely important that everything people need for their basic well-being is provided, and provided effectively. Safe water to drink, medicine when you're sick, access to hospitals and healthcare facilities if you need urgent care. All of these things are absolutely vital. And again, we're seeing progress. The water pipelines that had been cut off or had been destroyed or had other challenges are being restored. That's good, but then once within Gaza, we have to make sure that the distribution works, and that requires some work inside of Gaza itself, including with the Palestinian Water Authority. So this entire ecosystem of care, of support for the people in Gaza needs to be front and center in our minds. And it's very much front and center in President Biden's mind. Again, this is what he's been focused on from day one. We're seeing good, important results, but got to see more, faster, as effectively and efficiently as possible. Let me leave it at that and take a few questions.
Thanks. Good evening, Mr. Secretary. Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly has threatened to go into Rafah regardless of whether there is an agreement on hostage releases and a temporary ceasefire. Has the Israeli government now, on this visit, perhaps provided a viable plan for Rafah? You've talked about needing a workable humanitarian plan if they are to proceed with an invasion. Or have they given you assurances that they would allow a deal to play out before proceeding with an invasion?
What we're focused on, as I said, is getting this agreement, ceasefire, hostage release, and then something to build on. And that's what we talked about today. in our meetings, and that's the immediate focus. And there is an agreement that if we're able to get the deal, we get the ceasefire, get the hostages out, we'll look for ways to build on that and have something that's sustainable over time. On Rafah itself, look, our position is clear. It hasn't changed. It won't change. We will not support a major military operation in Rafah absent an effective plan to make sure that civilians are not harmed. And no, we've not seen such a plan. And at the same time, there are other ways, and in our judgment, better ways, of dealing with the real ongoing challenge of Hamas that does not involve or require a major military operation in Rafah. We've been talking to the Israelis about that. We'll continue those conversations.
Mr. Secretary, you said that you're focused on trying to get these hostages out and trying to get Hamas to agree to this deal, and you're saying the ball is in Hamas's court. At the same time, the Prime Minister said on Tuesday that he would do a major assault on Rafah with or without a deal, and we hear from Israeli reports that he told you today that he won't agree to any terms for a long-term ceasefire. Now, all of that seems to undermine any incentive for Hamas to take this agreement, since part of their calculus might be to try and reach a long-term ceasefire. So how do you address that?
That's the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken there making some remarks as he inspects the amount of aid going into Israel, and he said that the amount of aid going into Israel has increased. Nonetheless, there are still challenges, as he put it, when it comes to making sure the aid inside Gaza gets to the right people and stop Hamas from intercepting it, as you, Danny Ayalon, were talking about just a moment ago. Doron Avital, once again, the Americans are quite clear they don't want to see a military operation.
No, he made the point very clearly. He talked about that the U.S. doesn't want a major campaign in Rafah. And
right, there are caveats, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly. All the time with this major campaign. The campaign through Gaza has changed from the north to Khan Yunis to Rafah. So the question, what is the major campaign? So the question of the Rafah campaign is, first of all, a question of if, and the question of when, and the question of how, if indeed we go to such an operation. But of course, ceasefire first, effective humanitarian aid first, ceasefire and hostage deal, and then let's see. The U.S. is not excited about any Rafah operation, that's for sure. He said it clearly.
Does Israel have a credible plan for the civilians sheltering in Rafah?
Well, not according to the Americans. I think there's nothing that cannot be done. Of course, it depends on the cost and the efforts to be put in it, and the timetable, of course. But what is clear from the Secretary's words is that they would like a ceasefire to build something on it. He didn't specify what is on it, but for him, a ceasefire would be the end of the war. This is what the Americans, how they foresee it. And as a segue also for them, maybe to start normalization talks with Saudi Arabia. And this is the grand vision. But again, the devil is in the details. And how to bring it about, I don't think the Americans have a clue how to move forward.
And of course, they have their own political considerations as well with the Democratic Party conference next month.
Yes, in Chicago.
In Chicago.
And it connects, of course, to the northern front that we didn't discuss, because if there's a ceasefire, a long ceasefire, then they can initiate this move that Hochstein is trying to initiate in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So they have a whole plan in mind. They need partners to the plan, and I'm not sure that Israel is a partner for their plan, but who knows.
All right. Okay, well, let's go back down to the south of Israel now, because our correspondent, Nicole Zedek, is there and has been with Secretary Blinken today. And Nicole, from the point of view of the Americans, will this be enough to convince critics of the Biden administration that it is doing enough to pressure Israel to get aid into Gaza and to ease civilian suffering there?
They're certainly trying to show the international community that that's what they're doing. You heard from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken just moments ago. The majority of his press conference was spent talking about humanitarian aid and how the Biden administration is doing everything they can to increase the aid along with Israel and to put pressure on Israel to increase aid. And according to Blinken, it's working. And it does seem that the Biden administration is happy with the increase in aid that we've seen over the past several weeks, ever since the deadly aid incident in the Gaza Strip where several World Central Kitchen aid workers were killed. Since then, we've seen a steady increase in aid, and Blinken says this is great, but it's not quite enough just yet, and they have to make sure that it is also sustainable. And so here at the Ashdod port, this is the port that was also opened following that incident. It's been open for several weeks now to receive some humanitarian aid shipments from the sea, but the United States wants to see more, and that's why they've been talking and planning and building this pier off the coast of the Gaza Strip. And Blinken just said it seems like next week it will be up, running, and allowing more aid shipments to come from maritime corridors as well. And so that is another big step from the United States to show that they are doing everything they can in coordination with Israel to increase this humanitarian aid. And one other thing, Laura, that I want to note that Blinken also mentioned when the IDF was sure to publish as well is that today also, the day that Blinken is here in the south, they opened for the first time the Erez border crossing in northern Israel as well. 30 trucks today went through that northern border crossing into the northern part of the Gaza Strip after they were first inspected in Jordan. And so this is another significant step via Israel and with support from the United States to increase the humanitarian aid specifically in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, because this is the portion where the United Nations and other international entities are warning that it's especially at risk for famine. But really, the UN, international agencies, the United States wants to see this increased aid really throughout the entirety of the Gaza Strip.
Nicole, thank you very much. Nicole Zedek there. Well, let's turn our attentions to the wider region now. And Iraq has repatriated hundreds of people from a prison camp in Syria that was set up to contain ISIS prisoners and their families. Baghdad has long been pushing for the camps, which are close to its border, to be shut. Some 43,000 people from 45 countries are in these camps, which are guarded by US-backed Kurdish troops. Well, with us now, Colonel Rich Alton is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a geopolitical consultant for Dragoman LLC. Thank you very much for being with us, Colonel Alton. Always great to see you. Iraq seems keen to get its citizens home from these camps, but many other people from other countries remain. Aside from security concerns, aside from the humanitarian concerns, rather, how much of a security risk are these camps for the wider region?
Well, it's good to be with you. I think the security risk is real because the longer that multiple generations stay in these camps, the greater the risk of radicalization or mobilization for terrorist purposes. The successful programs we've seen, and to a certain extent Iraq's program has been successful, have involved getting people back to their home communities and doing some de-radicalization and reintegration type activities. So the problem is when you keep the multiple generations in the same camps and they're under sort of lock and key from the guards that don't speak the same language in some cases that they do, the chances for them to come up with a whole new narrative that supports terror activities is very strong. For the 6,000 that are not Syrians or Iraqis out of these 43,000, it's even a more complicated program or problem because you've got small numbers and the home communities in some cases don't know what to do with them. So governments in Western Europe, for instance, have some radicals that are second and third generation, but not necessarily well rooted in those home societies. Whether to take them back at all remains problematic for many of these countries.
Meanwhile, let's talk about what's happening elsewhere in Syria. The regime is sending troops to Suwaida in the south, where there has been an uprising of Syrian Druze civilians for some time now. Can you tell us what's happening there?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yes, sure. We're talking about Suwaida.
And connection. I missed the last part of the
okay. Can you hear me now? We're talking about Suwaida in the south of Syria. The government has sent additional troops to kind of deal with an uprising, and this is Druze civilians. So this is quite rare. This is the Syrian Druze community, which has started protesting, which has for some time now been protesting against Bashar al-Assad.
Yes, Suwaida is an interesting case study in just how little success the regime has had, the Assad regime, in consolidating its rule. Now, of course, ethnically, the Druze are spread across multiple countries, not just Syria, but Jordan and even in Israel. And they have never fully been reconciled to the rule of Assad. Now, what you've got in Suwaida that's prompted a wave of protests over the last 18 months or so has been increasing presence of Iran-backed militias, the Quds Force and other Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces, and straight-out criminals who are engaged in criminal activity, especially trafficking of drugs and so forth. So that, continued with low economic and political rights for the people of the region, has led to crackdowns. There was the dispatch of Air Force intelligence, military intelligence, and Syrian Arab Army troops, reinforcements there last week. So clearly we've got a restive community that's not seeing a future in this zombie state of Syria that has really been hollowed out and sort of dominated by the Iranians and their militias, and the people have had enough of it.
And just real quick, Rich, Iran's presence in Syria, that is of particular interest to Israel, of course. There have been reports that Iran is withdrawing troops because they're scared of attacks by Israel. I think we've lost Richardson, sadly.
Well, I think the Iraqis are...
Go ahead, Rich,
yeah,
we can hear you.
No, I again apologize for the connection. Yeah. I think the Iraqis, certainly the Prime Minister Soudani, is trying to reduce the role of his country as a battlefield between Iran and the United States. He's trying to get the United States to reduce its military presence, and has publicly stated he'd like to see the American troops go home. I think he's also playing a slight game of trying to decrease Iranian overt military presence in the country so as to stop Iraq from being the battleground between either Israel and Iran or the United States and Iran. I don't think in the end he really wants the Americans all to go home. Certainly the Iraqis in the north, in Erbil, do not want that. And Soudani himself is largely dependent upon a U.S. advisory presence to fight ISIS and to train his forces. Also, the banking system is almost entirely dependent on U.S. dollars. So I think really what he's trying to do is step down the level of conflict in Iraq so that they're not part of this regional fight that's unfolding. But I don't think that the imminent departure of American forces is in the cards.
Colonel Richardson, thank you very much. Ambassador Daniel Alon and Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital are with me in the studio. And of course, what happens in Syria is of particular interest to
Of course, it's interesting, the issue of the Druze, because first of all, we have a strong Druze community in Israel that is part of the IDF for sure, part of the political structure and the nation build, the whole story. And the Druze usually were loyal to the president, to Bashar Assad. So it's interesting to see those conflicts in the south. Does it mean that there are a few changes? I mean, Syria is still recovering from the civil war. We have also the Russian presence there, which also relates to the delicate context that we have there, because we have those militia that are operating from Syria. So this is a front that is bothering us. It's not at the forefront of our confrontation right now, but it's there. We have to.
And there are reports, Daniel Alon, that Israel warned Bashar al-Assad to stay out of the war, otherwise Israel would topple his regime. What do we really
Exactly. You know, like in all other dictatorial regimes, the chief threat is to topple them. You know, not any damage to their country or the economy, but to topple them personally. And this was really given in very direct terms. And indeed, I think the Assad, and we know that, I guess, from intelligence sources, he would really like the Iranians to taper their presence in Syria and to control it better. And maybe we're coming to this because of the pressure of Israel and the success in taking out many of the IRGC.
More broadly, both Iraq and Syria are fed up of being a battleground between Iran and the United
Perhaps, but he owes a lot to the Russians, and we don't want to open this front, and we have to be very careful with the Syrian front. We have enough fronts at our hands. Let's play those fronts. And
yeah, the Russians would not shed a tear if the Iranians are out of Syria, because it's a client state for Russia.
A lot of international considerations. Thank you very much to you both. Doron Avital, Daniel, thank you. Now, 45 years after it was first floated, plans for an underwater railroad linking Spain and Morocco are resurfacing. If it does go ahead, it will likely be built in time for the FIFA World Cup in 2030, which will be hosted jointly by Morocco, Spain and Portugal. We can go to Morocco now. We're joined by Dr. Mohamed Shtatou from the University of Rabat. Good to see you as always, Professor. So it's a huge, ambitious project, isn't it? What would it mean for the freedom of movement between Spain and Morocco?
Well, it's been a long time project. It started back in the 70s, talking about it and thinking about it. So finally, probably it will materialize. And it's very important because building a tunnel between Morocco and Spain and Portugal, it will help the World Cup 2030. But it's the most important aspect of it is the fact that two continents will be joined, and the Europeans will be able to go into Africa very easily, and Africans will be able to go into Europe very easily. And another aspect which is very important also is the fact that it will help communicate between the different nations, different faiths and different cultures. And I remember here something that happened back when the Muslims were in power in Spain. There was something called convivencia, which is living together, where Jews, Arab, Muslims, and Christians live together in total harmony. So I think this is remindful of that kind of thing, which we hope it happens again in the world.
Yes, Queen Isabella brought it all to a pretty brutal end, though, didn't she, a few centuries ago? What about Morocco's strategy here, then? Is this part of its broader embrace of the West, normalisation with Israel, moving closer to Europe, kind of moving away from its neighbours who have embraced more Islamist ideals, shall we say?
Morocco is very middle of the way Islam. It's very tolerant, very open to other faiths, and very involved in interfaith, dialogue. So any kind of link with Europe would be very good, and also this link would be good for Morocco and also for the Middle East. And we know that Morocco and Israel have a very strong alliance that did not suffer at all during this war. And this convivencia that I'm speaking about could be a good example for the future in the Middle East. And this link with Europe could help things in the future between all these nations, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East.
It is a very ambitious plan. It's also very expensive. Who's paying for it?
Well, Morocco doesn't have the means to pay for it, obviously. Probably Spain and the European Union and maybe some Gulf states will also be interested in investing in that. But in the end, I think all these people are interested because it is a very important geopolitical, structure, which help many people get together, which help Europeans come to African markets, and we know that Africa is the future of humanity today, and invest in Africa. And we know also that people from countries from the Middle East would be interested in investing in Africa. There is Israel, which with Morocco is trying to invest in Africa, and other countries like the Emirates. And I think it will be a very good idea. It will be a very good project in the long run because it will help many countries get together and many faiths get together.
Wow,
and that's very good.
Taking the train from Madrid to Casablanca sounds very exciting. One day, let's hope it will be a reality. Mohamed Shtatou, thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you for watching. That's the end of the show. Stay with us. Caleb Pinterbeat will be with you after the break.
Tel Aviv is ranked the happiest city in the world and the best place to own a home. For 3 generations, the Ben Shalom family has built boutique apartment buildings in the most desirable locations. From restoration in historical locales to homes along Park HaYarkon, Ben Shalom is a one-stop shop from start to finish and friends for life.
Esta semana en News 24, Israel bajo ataque. News 24 en español trae el análisis y la información de los acontecimientos de la guerra Espadas de Hierro.
Entrevistas exclusivas, reportes desde la zona de guerra, la reacción de los países hispanoparlantes.
News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en I24 News.
Welcome to this special broadcast on I-24 News. I'm Khaled Ben-David. It is day 208 of Israel at war, and while fire continues on multiple fronts, all eyes now are on the Hamas leadership, which reportedly is asking for clarification on the terms of a new deal that would free some of the 133 hostages held in Gaza in return for a temporary ceasefire. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today, urging Israel to accept an agreement that some ministers of the government oppose. But Netanyahu said Israel will carry on its battle against Hamas to the end, even if a truce is called. Senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has more on Blinken's mission here and U.S. pressure to get a deal done now.
Not much can stop an Israeli military tank, but a long-awaited ceasefire for hostages deal between Hamas and Israel might. The stakes are getting higher by the minute as the world holds its breath. U.S. President Joe Biden stating that the only obstacle to an immediate ceasefire and relief for civilians in Gaza is Hamas. With domestic political criticism mounting against Washington's support for Israel's war in Gaza, the Biden administration has been pushing increasingly harder for a ceasefire. On Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken landed in Israel again and met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. He also met with families of some of the hostages being held in Gaza since the beginning of the war. SOS, USA! Biden addressed a group of protesters in Tel Aviv who are calling for the Prime Minister to reach a deal now.
Bringing your loved ones home is at the heart of everything we're trying to do. And we will not rest until everyone, man, woman, soldier, civilian, young, old, is back home. There is a very strong proposal on the table right now. Hamas needs to say yes and needs to get this done. That is our determination, and we will not rest, we will not stop until you're reunited with your loved ones. So please, keep strong, keep the faith. We will be with you every single day until we get this done.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been under increased domestic and international pressure to reach a deal and has softened his original demands. But looming over the negotiations is Israel's promised military operation in the Hamas stronghold of Rafah in Gaza, which Netanyahu says will happen regardless of a deal. Another main obstacle is Hamas's demand that a ceasefire be permanent, something Israel refuses. The terror group that governs the Gaza Strip is expected to respond to what the U.S. is calling an extraordinarily generous Israeli offer within the next few days. After months of stalled negotiations, now cautious optimism.
Now, getting more humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza has been one of the key missions of Secretary Blinken's visit here. The latest pieces of that effort is today's reopening of the Erez crossing in North Gaza and a new U.S.-built pier along Gaza's coastline that will facilitate the shipping of supplies directly by sea. Joe Brown takes a closer look in this report.
A figure of aid. Satellite images have been released showing the construction of the so-called floating pier, a platform acting as a port around 7 miles off the coast of Gaza, which will allow for greater humanitarian aid to reach the Gaza Strip. The US-built pier will cost around $320 million, around double the original estimate, and provisionally will be ready as early as next week. The pier will consist of a floating dock, where ships can drop off their aid. From there, they will be taken via third-party trucks down a causeway that is connected to the Gaza coastline. The floating dock can supposedly hold 1,800 tons of aid per day. This comes at a pivotal time for Israel, as international pressure is growing on them to allow more aid into the Gaza Strip, both from the US, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken pressuring Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the Americans' 9th visit to Israel since the war began, as well as from international bodies.
We must do everything possible to avert an entirely preventable human-made famine. We have seen incremental progress recently, but much more is urgently needed, including the promised opening of the 2 crossing points between Israel and northern Gaza, so that aid can be brought into Gaza from Ashdod port and Jordan.
The aforementioned Ashdod port has been the site of protests from right-wing Israelis over the past few months, mirroring those from the Kerem Shalom crossing, as a small pocket of the Israeli society has shown opposition to the aid being sent into Gaza, as they claim it is being hijacked by Hamas terrorists. But this isn't stopping Israel from sending hundreds of trucks of aid into Gaza in order to limit the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding. The IDF claims that a daily average of 350 aid trucks have entered Gaza over the last month, as well as aid drops from foreign countries. Coupled with the new pier, this aid will be essential for the Gazan people and for Israel's operations in the Gaza Strip.
And Secretary Blinken is in Ashdod this evening at the port. He made a statement there a short time ago. For more, let's go to our correspondent, Nicole Sedek, who's also in Ashdod this evening. And Nicole, interesting, Secretary Blinken making that visit there, certainly a key part of his trip to Israel.
Certainly a key part, Kalev, as we're focusing not only on the hostage release deal and temporary ceasefire. That's definitely a main point of Blinken's visit, but another one being this increase in humanitarian aid. That's why he came here to the Ashdod port to see exactly what's been ramping up over the past several weeks since this port was opened. It only opened recently following the deadly aid catastrophe where several World Central Kitchen aid workers were killed in the Gaza Strip. And since then, for the past several weeks, that's when we've seen Israel really ramp up their humanitarian aid efforts with the push from the United States. And so that's why Secretary of State Blinken wanted to come here, see exactly what's been happening, and monitor how Israel is also looking out and investigating and inspecting all of these aid deliveries as well. He says that he's happy to see this increase, but it's still not enough. And he wants to make sure that although the momentum that we've seen, that it's a sustainable momentum and that this increased humanitarian aid can be sustained even as the people in Gaza desperately need it. Take a listen to what Blinken had to say here at the Ashdod port just moments ago.
We have seen in recent weeks real, meaningful progress that is starting to make a difference for people in Gaza. Yesterday we were in Jordan. Some of you saw the trucks being loaded in Jordan. They went through Erez for the first time today. And that's very important because that's direct access to the north of Gaza. And this is the result of a very important collaboration involving Israel, involving Jordan, involving as well the United Nations. We have our own maritime corridor that is probably a week away from being operational. And here in Ashdod, Israel's primary port, we're now seeing a real flow of assistance that is going to the people in Gaza.
Nicole, certainly U.S. wanting to see that aid going into Gaza to ameliorate some of the scenes that we see in international news coverage of the situation there. But of course, the other component here, as you mentioned earlier, and certainly key focus, is getting a hostage deal. Of course, Israel and the U.S. want to see those hostages released, and there are U.S. citizens involved there too. But also getting at least a temporary ceasefire, something the Biden administration really wants to see, take some of the political heat that it's facing, certainly domestically and internationally.
And that's also something that Blinken mentioned while he was speaking here in Ashdod, not only the humanitarian efforts as well, but as you mentioned, he's still cautiously optimistic and pushing for a deal to go through. And he says that the framework that is being discussed right now, be it temporary, there is the framework for it to be extended. But this is where we're still hearing the little bit of a dilemma between Hamas and Israel, because Hamas still wants to see reportedly a complete end to the war and a ceasefire, whereas Israel, specifically Netanyahu and his government, say this is going to be temporary and the war will continue, specifically with an eye on Rafah next. They say even if a deal does go through, this temporary ceasefire, it's not going to completely take the Rafah operation off the table. It's just going to postpone those plans and make it pushed back into the future. But Netanyahu is standing his ground and says that it's still going to happen. And so we'll see exactly how it does unfold. But Blinken was strong in his statements as he's been here to make sure that the blame right now is fully on Hamas to accept a deal. Israel, he says, has given an extraordinarily generous offer on the table. Even if it doesn't include a complete end to the war, it's still extremely generous, according to Blinken and the Biden administration. And so now it's up to the Hamas terror group to actually accept the deal and release these humanitarian hostages. We're not talking initially about these soldiers, Kalev. We're talking about humanitarian hostages, women, children, elderly men, the sick. Those are the 33, according to the reports, that would be released in this first wave. And really, that's all Blinken is asking right now, immediately, for Hamas to release in the immediate future.
All right. And hopefully there will be some movement. We'll try to be cautiously optimistic if we even can. Nicole Tzedek there at the Ashdod port. Thank you for that. And joining me in studio is Yaki Dayan, the former Israeli consul to Los Angeles, or in Los Angeles. Yaakov Lapin, military and strategic affairs analyst at the Miriam Institute, also for the Jewish News Syndicate and Alma Center. And Yaki, let's look at Secretary Blinken maybe coming here hoping that by the time he was leaving, there'd be some good news towards a hostage deal. But it really, again, we're reminded, it really just comes down to maybe one or two people sitting in bunkers in Gaza, the military leaders of Hamas. And at this stage, it's really uncertain how it's going to go.
Yeah, so Blinken is coming here to implement the grand strategy of the United States. They have an exit strategy, only one plan. They have no plan B, just plan A. And it is a hostage deal, phase one, that would lead to a phase two, that will lead to a cessation of war, that will lead for the entry of moderate Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and eventually to a process of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel that would lead in the future to a Palestinian state. That's the grand strategy of the Americans. Blinken here is to reassure or to make sure that, he brings the message to Prime Minister Netanyahu coming from Saudi Arabia that normalization is in the hand of, he can reach that, and making sure, in a bit even tying up the prime minister to make sure that he sticks to what he agreed in the hostage deal. And now, as you said correctly, this is only up to the Hamas, that Prime Minister Netanyahu will not do any kind of a U-turn because of his coalition members or any other member, and he will stick to what he agreed, as Secretary Blinken mentioned, a very generous offer by the Israelis.
Right, and at the same time, though, yes, sticking to the terms that were agreed to with the Egyptian mediator, which is this temporary ceasefire, but Prime Minister Netanyahu at odds to stress that this is a temporary ceasefire. Israel will continue the war against Hamas at some point, and a message, a quite strong message, just this evening, just in the last few minutes, from the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army, General Halevi, saying, vowing that the army, the military, will continue its military efforts, not just in Gaza, but also in northern Israel, thinking about those residents in the north and those people living along the border with Gaza.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the hidden reasons for Blinken's visit, trying to lobby the war cabinet to basically tone down the Rafah operation. That's what America wants to see. If it can't prevent it altogether, then I think the Biden administration is going to try and apply very heavy pressure to make this a lower scale, smaller scale operation. And I think that most of those efforts will actually be unsuccessful because you cannot destroy what's left of Hamas through targeted raids in a place like Rafah. It requires the evacuation of over 1 million people. We heard the IDF in recent days pointing out where it plans to move those people, to Khan Yunis and to an expanded humanitarian zone at Al-Mawasi on the Gazan coastline. The plans are in place. There are 2 IDF divisions that are waiting for the green light, but even when that green light will be given, it will take at least 2.5 weeks to start implementing the evacuation phase. The difference is that once that begins, I think the IDF will probably move in a way to make sure that checkpoints are set up to prevent terrorists from leaving Rafah with those civilians, as we saw happen during the evacuation of Gaza City. And the other thing I would point out is that, we talk about all the clauses of the deals that are on the table. The Egyptians have been leaking it. Others have been leaking, the details of these proposals. But at the end of the day, there's always one clause that has so far been presented by Hamas as the deal breaker, and that is a permanent end to this war. And until now, every offer that Israel has put on the table under pressure or through its own initiative has been rejected because of the absence of that clause. Yahya Sinwar wants to survive this war. He wants to prove that his forces, the forces of jihad, can come back and can survive any war, can take over Gaza. He's got his eyes set on Gaza, on the West Bank, and he may not have enough incentive, we have to keep that in mind, to accept this deal. But if he sees tanks heading towards Rafah, he may change his mind. So I think we're in for a very complex period with contrasting reports, and we'll have to be patient to see how this plays out.
Anyhow, a deadline will be given, because Israel would not accept any delay in this hostage deal that is taking place right now.
Right, it can't. Obviously, there's probably a timetable. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed that there's a date circled on his calendar, and presumably there is some kind of target date for a Rafah operation that's been set if no hostage deal has been reached. Now, you did mention, Yaakov, that some of the details supposedly of that agreement that's been hammered out in Cairo have been leaked, but mainly by Arab press. And of course, we also have, we've mentioned the domestic political pressure, the far-right ministers in Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet threatening to leave the government if it approves this deal and even derails, at least temporarily, the Rafah invasion. Let's take a look at this report by our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran, who takes a closer look at all that.
As Israel awaits Hamas's response to a proposed deal for a Gaza ceasefire and the release of hostages, far-right ministers in the ruling coalition are set on blocking an agreement, calling it, quote, a humiliating surrender.
חיילים שעזבו הכל מאחור ויצאו להילחם למען המטרות שהממשלה הגדירה. ואנחנו זורקים את זה לפח בשביל עכשיו להציל 22 איש או 33 איש או לא יודעת כמה. אין לממשלה כזו שום זכות קיום.
I finished the meeting with the Prime Minister at my request. I warned the Prime Minister, if you don't enter Rafah, God forbid, we end the war, God forbid, there will be a terrible deal. The Prime Minister promised that Israel will enter Rafah and will not end the war, and promised that there would be no terrible deal.
Meanwhile, the Lebanese Al-Akhbar newspaper published details of the proposal sent to Hamas. The three-phase deal would reportedly see the release of at least 33 hostages. All the women, civilians and soldiers, minors and men over the age of 50. In exchange, Israel agrees to a 40-day truce that could be extended and will release 20 Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli hostage. The mediators, according to the proposal, hope the deal will bring upon, quote, sustainable calm in Gaza.
The state of Qatar calls for an immediate ceasefire, an end to military operations, and the release of all prisoners on both sides, and the provision of all humanitarian and relief assistance.
And so, with Hamas's response expected on Wednesday, the prospect of a deal to save the remaining 133 hostages is also threatening to collapse the current coalition. Once again, the Israeli government finds itself walking a tightrope, both inside the cabinet room and outside it.
And here we are Wednesday night, still with no clear response from Hamas. And this is a tough waiting game for the hostage families. Let's go to Balir Sladin, our correspondent who's out at Hostage Square there in Tel Aviv. And Balir, this time it seemed to be coming so close, and yet it seems more delays. Hamas putting up now supposedly asking for clarifications. Again, the consequences for those families, especially, first of all, on the personal level, the consequences for those families if this is a disappointment. And then, of course, Israel in the region, if no deal is reached, and then we have to move on to the next phase of this conflict.
Yes, exactly. Now, focusing on the families of the hostages, as you were saying, here in Tel Aviv, there was a demonstration, a small one, but yet the daily demonstration here at the Hostages Square or close to it in the Kiryat, the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. Families of the hostages and their supporters demanding, of course, the release of their loved ones and that the government accepts any deal with Hamas that returns the hostages back to Israel. That is happening while we see that families of fallen soldiers in Jerusalem are actually calling for an immediate action in Rafah, immediate operation in Rafah. So we see that there is a discussion here in Israel. We've heard that discussion also from Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and families of the hostages that think that only an operation in Rafah, only military action would bring back their sons and daughters and not the deal with Hamas. So this discussion is alive here in Israel in general. Now, if Hamas says no, and there is, of course, a possibility that's what we're going to hear from Hamas, maybe we're going to hear yes, but the last word is going to be no, we want more concessions from Israel. We want Israel to guarantee us that it will end the war. In this case, of course, Netanyahu maybe won't even have a government if Israel accepts that specific Hamas demand of ending the war, something that Netanyahu vowed over and over again that will not accept. But if Netanyahu and the government does not try again, then it means that only an operation in Rafah is the only option for Netanyahu. This will, of course, affect the ongoing, let's say, not a very good relationship with Washington. Of course, this will affect the mega deal that everyone's talking about with the Saudis. We see that Blinken, that came from Riyadh today, he brought with him some sort of a mega deal that includes the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it needs to be, of course, after the establishment, or at least some guarantee to the establishment of a Palestinian state, something that Israel is yet to accept. So maybe we're going to say also that this mega deal is going to be very far, far away, and maybe it's not even going to be reachable after a few months because of the election in the United States. So everything is going to be clarified after the Hamas response, but we're of course still waiting for that response and still waiting for what would Israel do after we get that response from Yahya Sinwar.
All right, Balir Sladin, thank you for that. Yaakov, I don't know the sort of the nitty-gritty of the negotiations. It's all based on reporting, not statements. But one of the things, clearly Israel is not going to give a guarantee that it's going to end the war. But supposedly there's going to be a dialogue established towards coming to a permanent truce and a ceasefire. And Hamas is trying to ask for some clarification. What does that mean? What that kind of dialogue entails? And the question is if there is any sort of creative diplomatic wiggle room where Hamas may be given some reassurances, not by Israel, but by some of the other parties involved in the negotiations, that Israel, in essence, can say, well, we didn't accept that part. That's not our position.
Well, whoever gives those reassurances would be telling a lie, because Israel has made it perfectly clear the War Cabinet does have a consensus around this one point, which is that Hamas is not going to be allowed to survive as a terror army, not in any part of the Gaza Strip, and that its leadership will never be allowed to walk freely around the Gaza Strip again. That's simply never going to happen in the post-October 7th reality. It's a core Israeli security interest. It's one that Israel is willing to publicly and clearly clash heads with the United States over, with the United States looking to tone down this war and trying to contain it and bring it to an end. And Israel is saying clearly that this is a violation of Israel's key security interest of continuing the war until Hamas not only is gone as a terror army, but cannot come back, which means years of targeted operations, years, just like we saw in Area A of the West Bank. So whoever will promise Hamas anything else will be telling it something that's simply untrue.
And Yaki, we should, just to add to Balir's reporting, he said agreeing to a deal could mean the end of Netanyahu's government, the current coalition, perhaps. We should add that the opposition, Yair Lapid, leader of the opposition, has said he will support the government, maybe even join the government, at least on a temporary basis, something he's not done until now, to sit under Netanyahu to at least allow this deal to come forward. But that would mean a sea change, not just in Israeli politics, but in the career of Benjamin Netanyahu.
This is not an option for Netanyahu, Kalev, because Lapid doesn't promise Netanyahu to have a sustainable government.
No.
He knows that if he wants to sustain government, he needs Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and this is how Netanyahu thinks. He would do everything in order to preserve this coalition, and for him, the option of Lapid joining the government and giving him some kind of a backing for a deal, I would say is not sufficient. That's why he thinks politically as well. But just one point to what Yaakov mentioned, the deal will include phases. And the Americans are hoping that one phase will lead to another phase. And obviously, the first phase would not promise any end of war, cessation of war. But the big question is, if you go to a 3 phases deal, 2 phases deal, if the second phase promised not an end of war, but at least a long cessation of war, let's say a year, it would be then it would be hard for Netanyahu to say no, and definitely the Americans would pressure very much to accept this deal. They see it as an exit strategy. They don't want to see Rafah happening, although we insist on that, and this is a big clash between us and the Americans, and I think that the Americans understand that if the hostage deal doesn't happen, Rafah happens. So this is a big if.
Okay, the only thing is that would be the end of Netanyahu's government as well, with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, if a secession of 6 months to a year, and he'll be back where he started. The prime minister is between a rock and a hard place, so between as they say in Hebrew, more the hammer and the anvil. In this case. Gentlemen, stay with us. We are going out for a brief break. More on our special broadcast when we're back in a few moments.
I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds.
De la frontière qui sépare Israël.
The state of emergency and war in Israel.
bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News channels, now on Hot.
Ой, осторожно. У него мало таких бородавочек, у него как-то побольше на спине.
Welcome back to this special edition on I-24 News, day 208 of Israel at war. Well, let's move now, focus on the United States. And if you think things aren't getting out of hand on some American college campuses with these pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests, let's take a look at some scenes from last night at UCLA, the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
Segregation! This is Jim Crow segregation! Shame on UCLA! This is like Jim Crow era segregation!
College days. And the scene was no less chaotic at New York's Columbia University, where police finally moved in to remove demonstrators who had forcibly occupied a campus building. More on that in this report by Adam Bernitz.
It was the proverbial straw that finally broke the camel's back. U.S. police got tough with pro-Palestinian demonstrators at Columbia University, raiding a building they had occupied and arresting scores. The spotlight has been focused on Columbia, the epicenter of the pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian demonstrations which have dominated college campuses across the U.S. Despite all attempts to remove them, the protesters had remained defiant.
We demand divestment. We will not be moved unless by force.
But now, they may have gone too far. Following Columbia University's threat to expel students who occupied a classroom building, the situation escalated with the storming of Hamilton Hall, intensifying the nearly 2-week standoff between administrators and pro-Palestinian activists on the Manhattan campus. The NYPD identified professional outside agitators in Columbia University's protests in recent days.
We are seeing the tactics changing in a way that's endangering public safety. These once peaceful protests are being exploited by professional outside agitators, and the safety of all students, faculty, and staff are now a concern.
With Columbia University facing a lawsuit for not protecting Jewish students, and Hamilton Hall under siege for almost 24 hours, Colombia President Shafiq took action, calling in the NYPD to restore law and order. In a dramatic overnight operation, police called protesters to exit the building. The NYPD was at the ready with zip ties. With little sign of cooperation, the police, SWAT teams and counter-terror squads then surged inside and cleared 30 to 40 anti-Israel protesters from Hamilton Hall. Scores of officers entered through a window and removed protesters, some of whom were taken into custody and removed from campus on buses. This confrontation echoed a similar incident 56 years ago when police dispersed students protesting the Vietnam War from Hamilton Hall. Reports suggest over 100 people were arrested during the operation. The NYPD emphasizes that the protests at Colombia and elsewhere are not taking place in a vacuum.
Some of whom have been known to our department and others for many years for their dangerous, disruptive, and at times criminal activity associated with protests.
National protests are expected to escalate rapidly, indicating that the Columbia University saga is far from over.
I'm moving.
And for more, let's go now to Columbia University in New York City and our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. And Mike, what's the atmosphere there in Columbia? That battle over that one hall may be done, but this ongoing battle at Columbia and other campuses surely is going to continue on.
That's right, but at least for today, Kalev, all is quietly and surprisingly going well here thus far today. There's still a massive NYPD presence out here. We see police cars lining the street along Broadway. Same thing on the other side of campus on Amsterdam Avenue, where the two main gates to the university lead inside. The campus itself is essentially shut down. There's no classes. Everything has gone remote in the wake of the protest and the removal of the protesters yesterday. Only students who actually live in the dormitories on campus and essential university personnel are being allowed in. Even faculty and administrators are not being allowed inside today, just to keep everything as calm, as quiet, as empty, essentially, as possible. Here outside, there's been little activity as well. Back behind me, about, 150 feet, there's a rather deranged anti-Semite screaming out slurs to passers-by. A little bit here to my left is a Chabad Columbia student who goes also to the Jewish Theological Seminary. He talked to us a little while ago about his experiences lately, and we'll bring that to our viewers a little bit later on. But there's been very little interaction, very little interaction with police officers and pro-Palestinian students here today. Just very quiet after the huge storm here yesterday. But that's not the case, elsewhere around the country. We're seeing fights between pro-Israel supporters and pro-Palestinian supporters at UCLA, which finally led to police action there. They had refused to go in until those fights erupted yesterday. We're now seeing the House Oversight Committee announce that they're going to hold a hearing next week as to why the Metropolitan Police Department isn't breaking up the pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian encampment at George Washington University. We saw Fordham University, not far from here, a pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas encampment go up there today. So just because things are quiet here doesn't mean it's like that around the country.
Right.
Carlos.
Mike, we're also seeing some schools, and Northwestern being one of them, coming to sort of agreements with some of the protesters in which they agree that they'll reassess their investment policies, look at the divestment issue with Israel in return for some of these encampments being reduced. And those agreements are being criticized by Jewish organizations as basically a kind of capitulation by some of these universities to the demonstrators.
That's exactly right. Not only at Northwestern University there in Chicago, but also Brown University essentially did the same thing, saying that their board is going to discuss possible divestment matters and vote on it in October, though that being kicked so far down the road, it's unlikely that anything will come of that, more of a way to just, quiet down the protesters and let some time pass. Nevertheless, Jewish organizations very critical, saying, listen, this is an unauthorized protest that have caused major disruption. It's been threatening to Jewish students on campuses across the country, including there at Northwestern University. There have been violent chants for genocide, and to simply reward those protesters by saying, okay, now we'll discuss your demands, and more than that, act upon them, certainly sets a bad precedent. And they say it's no surprise that these encampments and these other activities are taking place elsewhere around the country and growing it seemingly by the day, saying if you're going to give in, well, what else do you expect here? It's just not the right time to give in. There were negotiations here at Columbia for several days. Eventually, the president here said enough is enough. The negotiations aren't going anywhere. It's only getting worse with the occupation of Hamilton Hall on the other side of campus. 2 employees were actually taken hostage for a brief amount of time, security officers, before being let go. The university president said she secured their release. That's her term, not mine. She said enough was enough, and that's exactly why police were finally brought in here yesterday. And I would expect, if this continues across the country, we'll see further action, as we've seen in places like Texas, Florida, and elsewhere in the coming days and weeks.
Right. Some of these demands: divestment from Israel, ending cooperation with Israeli educational institutions, Israeli educators. I mean, well, that these should even be thought of as being negotiable is a distressing thought. Mike Wagenheim there at Columbia University in New York. Thank you for that. And Yaki, Israel's former consul in Los Angeles, if I'd asked you if you would imagine see scenes like that at UCLA, I could just imagine.
The short answer is no, and we have to define very accurately those protests. They are pro-Hamas, not pro-Palestinians, not anti-Israeli. They are pro-Hamas. If you listen carefully to the content, this is the generation of woke progressiveness, and those demonstrations couldn't have happened on a different issue. I mean, if it was against the Afro-American, Black community, LGBT, all those kinds of demonstrations couldn't have happened in the United States. Only against Israel and the Jews it can happen. And I think that what the president of the Columbia University did was a bit too late, too little and too late. She should have called the police way sooner. And as a former Angelino, I can tell you it was uplifting to see the Jewish community standing up against those demonstrations, because I would expect to see in the biggest Jewish city in the world, which is New York, or the second largest city, which is Los Angeles, the Jewish community also being extremely proactive and going against those demonstrations, because eventually there is a lot of anti-Semitism over there, and I would expect to see a very hard and strict pressure from the administration there in the university.
And I'll just add, maybe the American Jewish community and organizations might consider a public, peaceful march or demonstration of solidarity of some kind.
At least that.
As we've seen. Yeah. All right, Yaki Dayan and Yaakov Lapin, I want to thank you very much for joining us on the program. We're going to continue on and go back to this region, and where the United Arab Emirates is seen as a potential key player in helping forge a post-Hamas Gaza in the so-called day after. And the UAE has also joined in the humanitarian aid efforts there, last month dispatching truck convoys of supplies from the Gulf directly through to Israel for the first time. Now, the leader of Israel's political opposition, Yesh Atid Chairman Yair Lapid, is visiting the UAE today. For more on that, here's our Dubai correspondent, Bastian Buri.
Well, this is not the first time Yair Lapid has visited the United Arab Emirates and its capital, Abu Dhabi. He made his first trip in June 2021 when, as foreign minister in Naftali Bennett's government, he inaugurated the Israeli embassy in Abu Dhabi and signed a number of economic cooperation contracts. Then, as prime minister, he received the Emirati foreign minister in Jerusalem, whom he then officially met again in August 2023 in Italy, when he had once again become leader of the Israeli opposition. So there's a history between Yair Lapid and the Emirati authorities. He's actually the Israeli leader who's had the most contact with Abu Dhabi in the past, which is why he is the one who will be making this trip. in the next few days, and not someone else. And it's all the more significant given that this meeting is coming at a time when Emirati representatives have yet to meet any member of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet. Since returning to power, Netanyahu has repeatedly planned visits to the UAE, which have been cancelled for various reasons, be it after Itamar Ben-Gvir's surprise visit to the Temple Mount, during various military operations in the West Bank, in Gaza, etc. So Yair Lapid comes to talk strategy and smooth the rough edges, both for the benefit of the Israeli government as well as for the post-war period. And the Emiratis, as you know, are very interested in the reconstruction of Gaza, not only economically, but also politically, since they want to place Mohammed Dahlan in a position of responsibility there. As you know, Dahlan fled Gaza and the Palestinian Authority more than 10 years ago, and since then, he's been acting as political advisor to the Emirati president for the Near East region, and he's probably the only credible Palestinian candidate who not only wants the creation of a Palestinian state, but also accepts that this state be demilitarized. Although it's true that he has very bad relations with Mahmoud Abbas, because Abbas drove him out in the first place. Dahlan's huge network is so large that he's a real key to Abu Dhabi, and this plan would satisfy many of the players in this conflict, except, of course, Hamas and Qatar.
Now, Lihi Lapid is a prominent author, writer, and activist here in Israel. She's well known for her newspaper and magazine columns and her novels, the latest of which has just been published in English translation as On Her Own, and which deals with themes of grief and mourning that are very relevant now, unfortunately, to current events playing out here. And while she joins us in studio very much on her own, we should take note that she is also a public figure as the wife of Yesh Atid Party leader Yair Lapid, leader of the political opposition, who we just heard about in his visit in the UAE. Yeah. But Lihi Lapid, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for hosting me.
Now, as I said, we will discuss your new novel, but I do want to note you're a public figure. One of the issues I've seen and that you've been very involved in is the issue of the hostages, and anyone who looks on your social media can see the time that you spent there. And I just want to get your view, because today is a almost critical day where a lot of discussion is this could be the last chance for a hostage deal to perhaps bring at least some of them home. And as someone who's spent time with the families out there and has been involved in the causes, just want to hear what your message might be on that this evening.
Well, you know, yesterday I was home, and I felt I can't be at home. So I suddenly, like a minute before dinner, I took my car and I drove to the families of the hostages to stand with them. I'm not blocking streets, but I stand with them and screamed and shout for the hope of making a deal. I think we have to do everything in our power in order to bring them back home, because it's such a huge wound. You know, it started at the beginning. We were thinking about the kids, the little kids, but I was all the time thinking about the women, the young women that are there, and we all try not to think what's happening with them, but I see their mothers that I saw at the beginning very strong, and slowly, like they're like leaf.
Right.
that you can't. I'm hugging them, but they're bones. So.
Lee, I'm not going to involve you in your husband's political decisions, but he has said that if the government agrees to a deal, he would support the government, at least for a time being, to see a deal through. That would be a difficult decision for many people in the opposition who have been out on the streets protesting this government and objecting to certain policies of members of it and Prime Minister Netanyahu. As someone who was out there in the opposition, I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you feel...
I feel sometimes there are things that are bigger than everything, and I think the hostages and the people that are there, you know, they're an hour away from here. They're not somewhere. It's unbelievable that we can't bring them back, and I think we need to to negotiate and do everything in our power, because part of the Israeli legacy from Entebbe through so many situations is that the country of Israel is going and saving the Israelis.
Right.
And we don't leave anyone behind. So it's something I don't know how we can live if we'll know that they were alive and we neglected them there. I think it will be something that will break the heart of the nation.
All right. Well, certainly the next days seem to be crucial. Let's talk about your book because, as I said before, it deals with themes of certainly mourning and grief, which are relevant. But maybe just briefly, I'd rather have you briefly tell us what it's about. Just briefly, the brief synopsis.
Nina is an 18-year-old that hides from people who chase her, and she got involved with bad people. She hides in a staircase in Tel Aviv, an old building. In 4 o'clock in the morning, an old woman is going down the stairs, opens the light, sees Nina. Nina wants to hide or escape when this old woman looks at her and say, "Dana, my Dana, you came back for me." She's not her granddaughter, but she goes and lives with this woman.
Right, and this woman is suffering from perhaps dementia, form of dementia.
Why, for me, the fact that the book is being published now in the United States and it will be in the UK is so important because it tells the story of a woman that lost her son.
Right, her name is Carmela.
Carmela.
Yes.
She lost her son in the army 30 years ago. And she's grieving every day since then. And I think that when people will read about it, they will understand. For us, you understand it, and me, because we are here. For us, soldiers are not a war machine. For us, soldiers are our kids that go to the army. And it's so different than people that go to the army as a profession. For us, we grow our kids and we want them to go to the army. We encourage them to go to the army. And every time I see a picture of a soldier that died at this war, maybe for other people from other countries, it's soldiers. But for me, there's a new Carmela, there's a new mother that will never be happy again, that will always cry and miss her child. And that's the reason. The book also, when it was published in Hebrew, people told me it's so Israeli. So now for me, I think it can give people from outside of Israel a glance of what it is to be Israeli and pay the price of living here and pay the price of your son.
Now, you're still a young person, and you're choosing to write someone who's facing memory loss and dementia. And I don't know if that's a personal thing. And of course, from what I understand, she's also concerned about losing the memory of the children, the son that she lost in the war. Is obviously there's a personal dimension, but is there a metaphor here too for Israel? Is this also supposed to be in some way the concern? Because that's a question that is a lot of people we should note, and that Israel's Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, is coming up, and there's a big debate about how Israel should be mourning at this period during a time when it still has to conduct this battle every day. So is there a story that somehow this relates?
Wow.
Or maybe just a subconscious?
It's a very, very nice observation. Thank you for it. I do think that Carmela wants everybody to remember her son, but no one remembers him after 30 years. Yes, we have Memorial Day coming soon. I think it will be very, very difficult because of the hostages. We're dealing so much with bringing them back home. We didn't start even crying and talking about so many people that died at the 7th of October. Young people that went dancing and young soldiers that died. And families.
I mean, the country is in a bit of, I guess, sort of a national PTSD, if you could say it. I mean, it's still in a kind of shock.
Yeah, and I think we are all afraid of Memorial Day, and rightly we are afraid because I don't know, I think we are at the verge of all our emotions here are outside. I think our skin is so thin already from sadness. So I really hope that Memorial Day this year will be quiet, and I think no one will celebrate Independence Day. Everybody canceled all their parties and everything because you can't. You just can't be happy. No.
Now, as you mentioned, the book is coming out. If you can hold the book up so you can show the camera is coming out now. And you're hoping that readers abroad, it'll give them some insight into the Israeli psyche and what Israeli experience. But of course, this is a challenging time for an Israeli book that deals with issues of war to be coming out. And I wonder how you feel seeing, we just showed some of these scenes from these colleges, these campuses in the U.S., and some of the things that are being said about Israel, almost as an abstraction, and how you feel about that, and how you, I don't know if you're planning to go on a book tour, but
I'm going on a book tour.
Your concerns about going out and being, and you've represented it, I know you've gone abroad and through with your husband, you also have represented Israel officially in some cases. How you feel about what's happening now abroad?
It's a tragedy. I can't believe how we lost this fight. After what we've gone through here at the 10th of October, losing the empathy of the world, losing the hug of the world. I mean, hug not.
Right, I understand.
I mean,
in the figurative
hugging.
Yeah, hugging, yeah.
I can't understand it, because they were supposed to protest for us, not against us, and we lost this battle of. I think. I'll tell you something. I think we look at Israel. There is David and Goliath, right? Always the story of the big bad guy and the small good guy. We think of Israel as David, and they look at us as Goliath, and we need to change the story of them. I will talk about Israel being right as much as I can. I'm so sorry that I'm sure that a lot of people in Barnes & Noble will hold the book, see that it's Israel, it's about Israel, and they will put it down. So what I want and what I wish is that some of the people will read it, open it and read about one little family looking for happiness at the middle of this whole balagan.
Right. Before I finish, I should mention, I mentioned you are an activist, and one of the causes you've been very active in is children with special needs. You have a child with special needs, and you've worked with them. There's Shekel is the organization, Shekel, that works with them, and this must be, just very briefly, a difficult and challenging time for those with everything else having to deal in those special circumstances.
Yael, our daughter, she's autistic. She's nonverbal, and she's 27. And through our organization, I saw the suffering of, a lot of people were evacuated from their home, and taking like a 30-year-old autistic guy and without to a room in the hotel. So we gathered a lot of people that were evacuated, people with special needs, and it's so sad to see them out of, far from their homes and everything.
Trying situation. Lihi Lapid, the book is On Her Own, coming out in English, and as you said, I hope some people do pick it up and it'll bring some insight